Welcome to the special meeting at the Poway Unified School District Board of Education on February 6, 2025 at 4:05. Please note this meeting may be recorded or broadcasted at the direction of the board, and the recording or broadcast may capture images and sounds of those attending the meeting. Please stand as we say the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Individuals wishing to address the board regarding this item on the agenda or items of specific concerns may do so at this time. A couple reminders as we have many newcomers to tonight's board meeting. Public speakers must fill out a speaker slip with your complete name, as well as a subject topic you wish to speak on, and submit it to Ms. Anderson before the agenda item is called. The board reserves the right to group speakers on the same topic together. Per our current board bylaw, speaking time is limited to 2 minutes per speaker with a maximum of 30 minutes unless waived by the board president. This is due to the necessity to conduct district business in an orderly and efficient manner. Thus, submitting a card does not guarantee you'll be able to speak, although all cards submitted will be retained as public record. Members of the public with the same viewpoint may select a few individuals to address the board on behalf of that viewpoint. We would like to remind you that if there are concerns regarding specific individuals, it is preferred that the speaker refrain from naming them publicly, and the appropriate complaint process can be obtained from Ms. Anderson. The board will not allow any disturbances or willful interruption that disrupts the business of the board. We have a practice and expectation to continue conducting our meetings with decorum, respect, and civility. With that, Clerk Plotsky, do we have any public comments?
We do. We have one for regular public comment and one for an action item or agenda item. So Lenice Seacrest.
There's only one.
Oh.
Only one.
Only agenda.
Oh, so they're not.
I'll go out.
Sorry. Then.
Yeah, I'll go now.
Oh. I thought they were broken. Sorry.
I'm hoping you are revisiting the Budget Advisory Committee questions proposed this last October, and I look forward to hearing new questions and solutions being discussed today. I do have comments to add. It's curious to me why the community is never provided with the district's financial state in the LCAP survey email. When asking a community to provide feedback on budgeting priorities, isn't that important? Everything that was funded with one-time COVID money should be examined. This includes administrative departments like equity and improvement. Funding failed DEI and restorative justice efforts are not sustainable. As contracts come up for renewal, please say no thank you to unnecessary, expensive, and problematic contracts from organizations like Concerned Parents Alliance, National Conflict Resolution Center, Illuminated Collective, Mending Matters, Panorama Education, Trans Family Support Services, and Balmer Inclusive. Last year's LCAP tables reflect a combined estimated actual expenditures of over $14 million for intervention counselors and increased counseling support. These allocations far exceed nearly all other expenditures noted. Is there room for cuts here? Starting with the social justice activists. Teacher engagement is a highly rated topic on the Thought Exchange right now. Does PUSD have unused or unnecessary software subscriptions like BrainPop that could be ended? As Michelle mentioned at the last board meeting, please revisit the City of Poway Joint Use Agreement for PCPA. Thinking of the Tierra Bonita scandal earlier this year, are taxpayer dollars being flushed down the toilet on those who are on paid leave instead of cutting ties? And lastly, please direct attention to the staggering amount of money that is spent on portables, settlement expenses, and contract cost increases as seen on the CSR every month. Okay, thank you.
Lucy Beard.
Good evening. Our district faces a critical choice. Act now or become delinquent with state-mandated reserves by July. Our current crisis includes $28 million of deficit requiring immediate action, and our reserves dropping to a negative 2.3% by 2026-27. By 2033, and indeed, 15 schools are actually considered critical condition. 9 of those campuses are actually considered low enrollment today. We're wasting financial resources on declining assets, such as the total $122 million of HVAC infrastructure needs sitting on the facility plan, with the $25 million proposal alone for the Rancho Bernardo High saw last board meeting, despite a 43% enrollment capacity. Stop trying to trim the fat and think and act strategically to invest in quality educational experiences, safe infrastructure, and future educational needs. Strategic school consolidation of just 3 to 4 underutilized schools will save $3 million per year in operation maintenance and admin efficiencies while retaining our critical teaching staff. It will also relieve $250 million off the facility's backlog plan immediately. You can also create monetization strategies that will create $10 to $15 million a year, including leasing close sites like recreational sports facilities to the public, public-private partnerships like the example of San Diego City Library with a high school integrated that duos for community value and rebuilding trust, opening up inter-district enrollment, and optimizing school boundaries for transportation. Then you can reinvest to make this a top school district in the state instead of its current decline through reducing our student-teacher ratios from being 8 out of 10 in the San Diego counties to the best, with elementary ratios declining to 20 to 1 or middle school ratios down to 25 to 1. And then we can modernize the remaining facilities or utilize vacant school land to build energy-efficient, academically performing, innovative schools that attract students from private schools and beyond, like the Design 39 campus model that you saw this morning with a 600-person waiting list. The choice is clear. Act now to optimize our assets, reinvest in our educational mission.
Thank you very much. Before I turn it over to, we're going to go on first names since we're doing a workshop. I know that Tim wanted to say a little something.
Thanks. Yeah, I just, similar to some public comments here, I just sort of wanted to set the stage for what's in my mind. So yeah, good afternoon, everybody. I've spoken about this before, but I've spent a lot of years in the business world navigating economic cycles like the dot-com bubble, the Great Recession, and COVID more recently. I've seen businesses thrive and I've seen them struggle. And I've been on both sides of difficult change, implementing it and enduring it. Throughout all of it, one principle has remained constant, and that's the need for continuous improvement. In my career, I've worked countless hours applying lean methodologies to technology, manufacturing, and healthcare, defining problems, eliminating inefficiencies, and ensuring every dollar is spent wisely. There are 8 types of waste we look to reduce: overproduction, waiting, transport, extra processing, inventory, motion, defects, and non-utilized talent. While these terms come from industry, they apply just as much to education. Where are we duplicating efforts? Where are we waiting too long to act? Where can we get better results with fewer steps? I challenge everybody in the district, board members, administrators, teachers, and parents to start thinking lean. Look around and ask, how can we be more efficient? How can we be more effective? Right now, about 85%-ish plus is our budget on personnel. I believe that number should actually be higher if it can. Our investment needs to be in the people that deliver and support education to the students. However, don't forget, a percentage has 2 parts, the numerator and the denominator. If we don't manage spending responsibly, we risk losing control of the equation altogether. In past meetings, I've also advocated for a zero-based budgeting exercise at the very least, looking at our finances not only from the top down, but from the bottom up. The best solutions are usually somewhere in between. And we need to re-examine everything, not just continue spending, because that's how we've done it in the past. One area that I do want to make sure we do address within this process is future budgets is facilities. As we all know, our district has a $180 million backlog of deferred maintenance. That's not just a number, it represents real classrooms, real infrastructure, real impacts to students and teachers. And the bigger picture, our long-term facility needs are over $1.8 billion. And we can't ignore that problem in these discussions. If we want the public to trust us, we need to prove that we are fiscally responsible. Before we even consider a bond measure to address these needs, we must demonstrate that we're making smart, strategic decisions with every dollar we have, and I don't doubt that we're on that path. I really do. Tonight, as we discuss the budget, let's commit to asking tough questions, finding inefficiencies, and making sure that every dollar directly serves our students, our teachers, our staff, and the long-term health of our schools. And thank you. I appreciate it. Thanks for the time.
Thanks, Tim. All right, Ben, I'll let you start the process.
Sure thing. Thank you. Thanks, everybody. To kind of set the stage, yeah, no problem. So we are conducting this board's budget workshop tonight as the first step in many steps. As you know, the district has implemented about $11 million in reductions in the current fiscal year, which is the 24-25 fiscal year, as phase one of budget reductions. As we're working on development of the 25-26 budget, we know we need to implement a second phase of budget reductions. As you know, the 25-26 budget will be brought for approval in June. Between now and then, staff will work to make recommendations for reductions as part of the budget that you'll approve in June. This workshop is a step in that process, but it is by no means the final step. This is part of a larger process, and in Tim's words, of a continuous improvement process that will drive our work, not just on the budget, but on all things, academics, et cetera. Tonight, the plan is to provide information that will inform the team as we continue constructing a budget that keeps students at the center. There's no doubt that we need to make bold and creative decisions between now and June. There's also no doubt that we need to be collaborative, that we need to listen to educational partners, and that we need to be willing to operate outside of our comfort zone as we wrestle with important decisions. I want to thank the entire team for setting us up for success tonight. I'd also like to welcome Mr. Dill, Eric, who's going to be taking the baton from Mr. Magnuson, Greg, as we move forward. Tonight, however, I'm going to turn it back to Greg one more time, he's going to walk us through the printed materials and lead the discussion this evening.
Thank you, Superintendent Chill. Thank you very much. I'm pleased to be here. I'm pleased to work with Eric as we kind of transition here in the district. I do want to say thank you very much to our Director of Finance, Joy Romero, as well as Justine Galura, who have just worked tirelessly to help put the package together, and Rhea Ausbach, our Planning Director, who also has been instrumental in enrollment projections, which will be the first part of our presentation. We're here today to really kind of move and engage with the board to build consensus around not only understanding the current fiscal and operation environment, but also what are the deficit reduction priorities as a board. We all have different views, but the board with the administration, stakeholders have to come together on a package, and that's how it best works. Develop consensus regarding the pace under which you will work down the deficit, if not balance the budget. You have resources to take time to do that. So this is not an emergency, but make no mistake, you have to move forward and you have to get moving with it. So with those objectives, we'll present materials that will work. We'll talk about enrollment. We'll talk about general fund allocations and just the various pieces of the pie, the shares, and some multi-year scenarios to bring some sensitivity to the approach toward working down the deficit. We'll get into detail on program budgets, and we will talk about class sizes and reports that we've generated, and then we'll conclude around talking about a fair share as a guideline and the planning status that is currently worked on to come up with ideation and initiatives for budget reduction, and then ultimately just touch base on the schedule. Please feel free to ask questions as we go along. I'm sure everybody here is going to be paying attention, and I know this is the first of what is several very important steps getting to your June budget. So with that, I'll proceed unless there's some questions right off the bat. Okay, very good. Okay, we've gone through the agenda for the most part. Let's move on to section 1, and let's get an appreciation for enrollment. What is up on the screen, what is in your binder, is a couple of charts on this first page. The first is a 4-year summary looking at month 4 enrollment by grade level. And there's some observations I'd like to make because I believe it really does cast a bit of the environment in which we're operating and the environment in which you need to be thinking going forward. I think as everybody is aware, this is the fourth year, I believe, fourth, maybe the fifth year, that the number of school-age children in California has declined. That was unprecedented up until about 4 or 5 years ago, and we're seeing that across the state. Obviously, Poway and San Diego County are no different than other counties in the state, and so I think Poway is starting to feel that, and this enrollment chart begins to show some of that. But there are some interesting trends in your enrollment. I'd just like to call them out. First off, I'm sure everybody is looking at the bottom line saying, well, where were we in 21-22 versus where are we today? And you can see that there is a loss there from 35,164 students enrolled to 34,411. That is declining enrollment. So the second piece is, well, what drives that? Let's look at the top yellow line. Let's look at kindergartners. So you can see in 21-22, your kindergarten enrollment in month 4 was 2235. Today it's 1962. And I think for anybody who looks at enrollment, you understand that on the natural, you have kids matriculating every year, and in that matriculation, you have kids moving from the highest grade level in your system out to college or into the next district for either middle school or high school. But it's really kindergartners that tend to drive it on how you backfill those migrations. And so what you see when you're looking at the chart is not only that migration, but you're seeing also at the bottom line a change on the natural. And I'm going to do a little math for you just to look at 24-25. And so if you can appreciate on the natural moving out 2,799 12th graders off to college to be successful, to do their studies at the next level or on to workforce, but you would be replacing them with 1,962 students. Let's say that enrollment in kindergarten does not go down, it stays roughly the same, 1,960 students. That's an 839 student loss. That's a big loss. We're not projecting that loss, and we're not projecting it for a couple of different reasons. But primarily is that when you look at your enrollment across the years, kind of an amazing thing happens here. It doesn't happen in all districts. But if you look at a cohort, let's take kindergarten in 2021. Started with 2,235 students. It got bigger in 22-23. It got bigger in 23-24 in second grade. I'm following the same group of students as they matriculate through the system. And then this year, they're now in third grade, and they're at 2,469. That's a wonderful phenomenon. You don't see that in a lot of places, and that can be attributable to development, that can be attributable to inter-district transfers, but it is a good phenomenon to have. And that migration across the grade levels in the cohort is actually reducing what would otherwise be a natural loss if it were not occurring. I think it's key for this district to pay attention to that over time to ensure you know how that's moving, if it's continuing to strengthen or if it's weakening, because that's going to be kind of the hook on how far and how fast the tipping point for enrollment, well, either decreases or increases. So just a piece to pay attention to. You also notice if you look at the right-hand column, which is the change between 23-24 and 24-25, you start to move forward and you see that just about at every grade level in 24-25, there's a smaller number of students working from bottom to top. So again, another symptom of declining enrollment. So high to low. And then finally, when we talk about inter-district transfers, which is not on the charts, it's of interest, I believe, to note that in 21-22, your net migration of students into the district, and that's after students who left the district, was 438 students. 24-25, that number is 242. So it's reducing, and that will put more pressure on this phenomenon of cohort growth through the years. So something to pay attention to, it's something to take a look at. And when we look at 25-26, thinking about 24-25, we're projecting a 60-student enrollment loss, when in fact, the real number looks like it could be as high as 839, but will be offset in some proportion. So this is the finicky thing about enrollment projections. You just don't know how many kids are going to show up until they actually do. And that plays into staffing and a lot of other considerations in the school district. So again, the budget plan looking forward is a 6-student loss, but you see what your enrollment looks like. Actually more important than enrollment, but
I have a quick question
please.
for you. Have private school enrollment gone up?
I have not seen the database on private school enrollment. I don't really know what the conditions look like here. I'm going to say it's status quo just from having seen it in other counties, but I don't know that for a fact.
Okay. And the reason I say that, I was involved in soccer when it used to be all rec and a little bit of competitive, and then it completely
Right.
switched to was all competitive and a little bit of rec. I'm just wondering if we're seeing our families, because they're more affluent, that they can afford the private schools if they're choosing to do that.
Yeah, that's a good survey to look at. I know, for instance, in charter schools, charter schools were the rage a few years ago, and everybody was afraid of charter schools, and what we find now is the big charter schools are starting to shut down because they realize this dropping enrollment across the state. So maybe that plays in, but looking at what's going on in private schools and charters in the area is a logical next step.
Can I also ask a clarifying question? You said it quickly, and it's not in the chart. Our inter-district transfer numbers are going down significantly.
They're about almost 50% down from where they were just 3 years ago.
Do we know why that's happening? I mean, they're not applying at all, or we're accepting fewer students?
I don't know exactly why, but the trend across this area, and I've looked at, and I didn't bring the chart, but I've looked at all of your neighboring school districts, and it's interesting to me that when you look at the decline from 2019 to 2023, because it's coming out of the CDE data, and they're a year behind, 23, 24, on a percentage basis, Poway is at 4% decline, according to their records. The neighboring districts go anywhere from 7% to 11% decline. So those around you are declining faster than you are, which, in the big scheme of things, I suppose is good, but it's still a decline. So everyone is having this problem, and if you go to the counties, north of San Diego, it's been in place a lot longer than I think you've seen it in San Diego County, so.
So I recognize that you don't have this information today, but since you brought it up, those inter-district transfers, I'm interested in the ones we are admitting. Where are they going? Are they applying to a certain school or program? Is there a reason they're coming here? And can we get more of them if we do more in
I'm sure your
some
attendance
areas?
office can give you all that data.
Yeah,
I've
so
got
I'd
big-
like to hear that next time we talk
Very
about
good.
this.
I wanted to make a comment about that. So I actually just, had a conversation with a parent. They are having trouble getting their district that they're living in, letting them released from, because but she said that her school that she's trying to apply, her other kids have gone to high school. Their attendance person there said, well, we can't, we're not necessarily looking for you. I'm like, absolutely not. We will take any child that's coming this way. We want your children. So, because I knew their kids didn't have IEPs. We definitely wanted them. So I'm like, it's your school home of record that's holding it up. Go back, appeal, and then try again. And call me if you're having still trouble. So it's the schools like San Marcos, Escondido, they're not releasing their students to come.
Yeah, I was going to just reiterate that. We've heard that across the board. To transfer between districts, you need first permission from your original district and then permission from the receiving district. But many districts are now saying they're not willing to let their kids go because they're not willing to take the loss of ADA. So that's not uncommon in the current environment.
Quick one, I think, sorry. Same question, I think, but the number you said was like 400 something. Was that the inter-district transfer number? What was that?
In
Net migration numbers, something you said?
Yeah, in 21, 22, after accounting for students out of, leaving Poway, the net was 438 coming in.
Thank you.
So just moving on to attendance, obviously attendance is a proportion of enrollment, and attendance is what we get paid on. So we look at just the attendance ratios that are coming up, and you'll see this in your month 5 report in next week's board meeting, but we're giving you a preview here to put it in context. We're at an average now of 95.5 roughly, percentage, 95.55 is the percentage of kids coming to school every day. You can see that that is above the December holiday time period, as you might expect, also a little bit of November. But it is falling, as is traditional after the beginning of the school year. We have, of course, 95% is the basis of the budget, so we're still slightly above that. That's good. So important to watch for the rest of the years. You know, in the multi-year, we have pegged 95.5% as the attendance factor. So good reference to pay attention to looking forward. There are charts for your reference on month 5 enrollment in the package. And I'll just scroll quickly through them and make a couple of notes. Elementary is accounted for here, and you can see we've got 15,428 elementary students as of the moment, and that includes both regular education and STC. And that is actually up, I believe, from month 1. That's good news. In the middle schools, we have 7,850 students, and that is up 6 students from month 1, again including SDC. And in the high school, we are down 32 students. We're currently at 10,838 plus the SDC students for 11,061 students. And there are 60 students in non-publics. Interestingly enough, when we look at SDC, we're actually down from the beginning of the year in SDC to 790 students. And that's down about 18 students, if my memory serves. We have a certified 24-25 P1 attendance at 34,405. In April, we'll certify P2, which is typically the measure that gets paid for from the state. And we'll see where that falls. If there are any other questions on enrollment, I'll go to enrollment projections. So we've had a chance to look at some trend data, historical. We've looked at where we're at currently, and now we're looking at the district's consultant, Fairchild Consulting, who for several years has done enrollment projections, long-term enrollment projections for the district. These long-term enrollment projections each year get looked at and then modified locally here by staff for factors such as inter-districts, any new development maybe wasn't accounted for, any other conditions. And so what goes forward for staffing purposes is not necessarily what's in the long term, but the long term does give us a trend in which to reference. And so you can see in the summary tables provided here, 2 different looks at it. We have groupings of elementary school children, middle and high school. You can see the relative totals by year as projected. Total reduction moving out to the 2031-32 school year is 1,684 students. Second table demonstrates it by grade level specifically. I believe the board has a copy of the demographer's report that contains all of this data and the detail behind it.
Quick one here. So this is 34 to 23, right? Is that the
2024 through 2032.
I'm sorry, for this year, right at the end of this year, 34,223 is the projection for the end of the year?
That was the projection for this year before, yeah.
Gotcha. And okay. Yep.
Yeah, and so comparatively, we're at 34,405. Neighborhood, yeah.
Greg, we did not have a copy of a demographer's report.
Oh, we should make sure you have that.
Thank you.
Thank you. We'll have a note of that and make sure we get it to you. We've included the charts just for reference on the enrollment. Again, you'll see these line charts for month 5. It's board meeting next week. If there aren't any other questions with regard to enrollment and attendance perspective, we can move on to talking about general fund. Okay. In your package for the general fund, I've included the first page summary of the unrestricted general fund at first interim, which provides us some detail to review. The second page is the multi-year projection from that same first interim report that connects back to and extends for 2 years into the projection for the unrestricted general fund. Next is restricted, same format, first interim summary as well as the multi-year and then the combined. So I'll work through that package here for just a moment. I know you have all seen this report. We're here today really talking about when we look at column D. I apologize for the screen. It's it's pretty fine font, but what it says in row E in the column D is that the district is currently projecting a $17,423,626 deficit for the 24-25 year from the unrestricted side of the general fund. Further down column D, what you find is the beginning balance of the general fund, which is at $72,720,645. Subtracting out the deficit, you're expected to have an ending fund balance in the unrestricted general fund of $55,297,000. Still very sufficient to meet your $11 million, $12 million reserve for economic uncertainties as required by the state. More than sufficient, clearly. We'll come back and discuss the expense side and some of the revenue side a little later in the package, but again, this is the official documents for the records that have been filed with the state. I will say that, of course, you'll have an update coming to you next month in second interim. So if we flip to the next page, we're now on the multi-year for the unrestricted general fund. And again, as you're aware, we can find that $17 million total down towards the bottom of the page in row C where it says net increase, decrease in fund balance under column A. So this tracks to what's published in the summary previous page. But it looks out to 25, 26, and then 26, 27 where the district's projecting deficits of $18,567,000 in 25, 26, and then another $18,698,000 in 26, 27. And as we discussed at the last meeting, these projections are just based on natural evolution without any intervention. So they really characterize the issue in which we need to address in the district to begin to truly manage deficit spending, bring it down closer to a balanced budget over time. You can also see in section D how that affects the ending fund balance. And as of right now, in that third year, the ending fund balance would still be $18,030,000, which holds you in good stead to meet your $11 to $12 million reserve for economic uncertainties, to remain positively certified by the county superintendent of schools and with the state. So good shape, money in the bank. It's really about how do we prepare to reduce those deficits over time, maintain an ending fund balance that's sufficient and comfortable for the board. Any questions just kind of on big picture unrestricted? We'll talk some more about what influences it. Yes.
The projected year totals column, that is basically the mid-year, the first interim budget.
Yes, so the current budget is
rework.
approved by
So
the board, correct?
Gotcha.
At first interim, yes. Gotcha. So let's move on to restricted for just a moment. Same vision, but a little different interest at the end of the day. Obviously, with unrestricted, you're funding your core program, you're trying to protect your reserves to make sure that in a declining environment that all things stay equal, you're providing absolutely the best program you can for your students, your staff, and all others concerned, while managing your resources. The restricted side is similar but limited. So the restricted side of the budget contains dollars that are provided for specific programs, and those dollars need to be expended on those specific programs and the services within those programs. I do want to take a look at it for a moment simply because so much one-time money and categorical support has flowed since the pandemic and following the pandemic that has somewhat distorted the restricted budget. And so let me just talk about that briefly. So again, we're looking at the first interim summary page. The restricted is the other side of the general fund. Unrestricted and restricted combined, they make up the total general fund. Again, the restricted side paying for programs. In a perfect world, the restricted side, you would get money in, you would spend it on that year's children, and it would zero out. No school district does that, though. and particularly with the lump sums of one-time funds that have come since the pandemic. So you have a balance, and you're spending that balance down over time before, in particular, one-time grants expire to spend on your community and your students. So you have a balance, you're going to be deficit spending because you've received those dollars in a prior year, but are expending them later in time. That's fund accounting, I'm afraid, but that's the way it works and that's the way it looks. So if we look at column D, row E, you see that you have a $34.99 million deficit in the restricted side of the ledger. And that sounds like a lot. Now, practice is we budget those dollars. Sometimes they all get spent, sometimes they don't, and when they don't get spent, they get carried over to the next year. So in the ending fund balance of the restricted side, there still remains, the beginning balance was $46 million, I believe it's $825,000. We will subtract out the deficit, and you'll have a remaining balance of $11.8 million for expenditure next year. And that's if you spend all of these restricted dollars as planned this year. May not happen, typically, for reasons I don't necessarily need to discuss here. We just can't swallow them all at the same time, but we budget them as if we want to. So it's important for the board to understand that out of that $11.8 million that's projected to remain, $8 million of that is the remaining one-time funds that are still out there. They're programmed, they're earmarked, but they're available. And so each one of the categories, and we'll get to them in more detail, each one of those have different ability in which to use them on a discretionary basis or on a very strict basis. So we can kind of talk about that. So restricted dollars have been and can be even a further part of your deficit reduction planning if used in compliance with the restrictions. But it is important that you note that after that $8 million, you're going to have about $3.5 million in continuing funds in the restricted side. And we'll talk about that some more when we look at multi-year scenarios. Again, as we did with the unrestricted side, we have restricted multi-year projection. And as I've described, if you, again, look down through column C, which is not the current year, but 24 or 25, 26, you can see that you're still deficit spending. You expect to spend that $8 million, one-time dollars. You end up with a balance, and I'm looking at section D, row C, $3.5 million, and that $3.5 million is committed. It's committed to the remaining restricted programs that are out there. But as you move to 26, 27, it is expected that you'll be working essentially with a balanced budget on the restricted side. And that's important because the restricted side for the last 7 years has basically offered opportunities to be able to support the unrestricted side and do things that you typically haven't done. Provide services that you typically haven't provided at a level that you typically haven't provided. And so at some point as you get to 26, 27, in the absence of another funding source, you'll need to be thinking about the balancing of the restricted side. And that's become almost a lost art because there has been so much money in the state in programs that are restricted that, well, it's always looked flush. And you can see on the revenue side, when you look up at the top of the table, that the district expects to receive $70 million a year plus in state revenues on the restricted side. Most of that is special ed funding, and we'll take a look at that in a moment. Any questions, comments on restricted side before I kind of move into how these are shared amongst both object code salaries and benefits, non-salary and benefits, as well as employee groups? Okay. There are 2 pages here that combine both, but it's pretty much straightforward. And it is really important, though, as you move forward because of this restricted balance falling low, that you pay attention to both sides of the ledger. So I'm going to move on to, yeah, that'd be great. Thank you, appreciate it. So we've got some charts tracking the change between what we spent last year and what's currently in your first interim budget titled the revised budget between 2023, 24, 25, And this is both personnel and non-salary. What we've done is we have grouped major object codes 1,000, 2,000, and 3,000, which are certificated, classified salaries and benefits, into one line just for ease of reading and seeing what's here at the summary level. So as we look at what we closed out last year, salaries and benefits, $310 million and change. This year, we're at 318. This is just the unrestricted side. So there's an increase there, right? And part of deficit reduction is how do you moderate these increases? And we'll get to another chart in just a moment on what 25, 26 may look like. The restricted side, you see a jump as well in salary and benefits, but not nearly as much because most of those restricted programs are going for non-salary things. So you see some of that growth, and now I'm referring to the change table on the right side of the page. You can see the salaries and benefits increase between restricted and unrestricted, and then as you look down further into both unrestricted and restricted, you can see where those changes are grouped up in terms of each one of the major objects, books and supplies, other services, capital, et cetera. You can see on the unrestricted side that the current budget is $1.3 million less than it was in estimated actuals on other services, but of course is more in books and supplies. And capital outlay just slightly, as well as other outgo, for $12.8 million in change between the end of the year last year and the current revised budget. That includes, of course, step and column costs and other inflationary costs between 23, 24, 25, 26, for the most part. So looking at the restricted side, a little different perspective. Most of the increases are in salary, or not in salaries, they're actually in books and supplies, and those are holders. As the budgets are put forward and developed, plans are still being made and moved to accommodate. So the tendency is to put dollars into those unrestricted until staff accesses them, and then we journal or move them to salaries and benefits as charged. So overall, combined increase across both restricted and unrestricted, 23, 24 to 24, 25, is about $37 million. And as I mentioned, there's a large budget of restricted dollars in there from one time that may totally get spent, but some of it may not get spent and may get carried over. And there will likely be some dollars out of unrestricted that are not spent as well. So there'll be some carryovers, the moral to the story. So that's kind of the division, without looking at a pie chart, of the dollars and cents related to salaries and benefits and other supplies as specified. And it mirrors the comment earlier that 85, and in some cases up to 94% of salaries and benefits, depending upon which version you look at, is people and benefits. It's compensation.
So can we go back on one slide?
Sure.
So in our budget this year, under the category of professional consulting services, we had budgeted $15 million. Last year, we spent $20 million. So I had asked for a breakdown of what these are. Do we have that in here somewhere?
It's later in the package, yes. It's in section 3.
Okay. So the, oh, sorry, that's not in the, it's in the budget online. Yeah. But actually, I'm curious on that. So can we turn to that? Can you refer us to where that is in the package? And before we go to that though, you know, obviously the people here by now know that this package is not online. And, you know, the board literally got this package the minute before this meeting started. And Dr. Churchill, that cannot happen again in the future. I think a lot of us stressed transparency with the community, and you, I believe, also committed to that. The public cannot possibly provide public comment if they don't even have the material in front of them. And, you know, and even the board didn't have this material before it. So I really hope this is the last time it happens. I appreciate that Mr. Dill has only been here 1 week, so this is not your fault. But this workshop has been scheduled for a month and a half. And so, anyway, I just want to stress, and we should be posting this material online as soon as possible, so anybody that's trying to follow can look at this material. I don't know if that's something Wendy can work on while we're doing this. But Greg, can you point us to where it is in that section?
Certainly, it's in section 3. We have line items by object code in section 3B. I'm happy to get there. And it's broken down by restricted or unrestricted and restricted budget.
So I believe that category is under 5,800, right?
Well, it's, the 5,000s are contracts and services. 5,800 gets to professional, and so if you look at the left-hand column on those charts, you'll see the codes that begin with 5,800 for that subsection within 5,000.
So it looks like it's page 29 on the packet is where 5,800 sits. And so I see 3.6 million for other services and contracts, which doesn't really tell us very much. I see $1 million for consultant non-INST. Do you know what that means?
Non-instructional.
Okay, so what are those consultants for, do we know?
Those might be technical consultants related to facilities, consultants like your enrollment consultant, and others.
Okay. And then I see online subscriptions for 4 million. So the third 5,800 altogether should add up to 15 million, is that correct?
Should. Well, let's see.
Oh, no,
Yeah, let me-
24 is all services.
So,
So just, a couple of people asked me, I'll repeat. So 5,800, the reason I'm talking about 5,800 is because that's on the budget, it's called professional / consulting services. And there's $15 million this year, it's $20 million last year. That's what I'm asking a question about it. So Greg, is this report both restricted and unrestricted together?
that is just unrestricted.
Just
If you flip the
unrestricted.
page, you'll get to the restricted portion as well.
Okay, so here we would expect to find a total of $9.5 million, so that looks about right. Okay. All right, thank you. Let's go back. Appreciate it.
Okay, to go back, we were, let's see, talking about employee, let's see, yeah, page 17, thank you. Got it. Two. Okay, so, yeah, I've still got the old package before it was renumbered, so.
Were you on this?
Yes, that's where I was getting started.
Page 15.
Very good. So we're talking salaries and benefits shared by unit or by employee group. And so again, this is a 3-year comparison, so it's 23, 24 actuals, our revised budget, and then where we project to be. Again, this is a reference point. Certainly before any changes are made, it will be updated at second interim, but for now it's a baseline from which to refer. And so as you look at and consider employee salaries and benefits, you know, you can look to see that moving from 23, 24 into the current revised budget, there was a 2.36% increase across the board, and you can see how it's broken down, unrestricted and restricted by share per group. And so we have PSCA units 1 and 2, we have the management group and cabinet, all grouped separately, but 2 groups in unit 1 and 2 for PSCA, and 2 groups, cabinet and management, and then PFT, and then others, those that are non-represented, to make the total. So I'm looking at the middle chart, the current revised budget is at 67.7% of total resources for compensation, essentially, of the general fund, unrestricted general fund, of the total general fund. little confusing. So unrestricted compensation is 67.7% of general fund expenditures in the revised budget, whereas restricted is 32.3%. So again, a feel there when we move to 25, 26, changes very incrementally to 68.12 to 31.88. There's an increase at the bottom line from 470 million to 479 million of about, that's an increase $9 million to get to 2% increase overall. So again,
Can you give me some examples of, I see the revised budget has others for 40 million. So can you just give me some examples of what falls in that others category?
so these are typically non-represented individuals, and a lot of, trying to think of who that is exactly here. Maybe you guys can. Substitutes, thank you, and others. Some districts, it's noon duty aides or playground aides. I'm not sure that. Yep.
So between those substitutes, avid tutors, there's $40 million a year?
And I'm sure there's other classifications. I don't know if some of your,
There's some
your
big-
walk-on
bigger-
coaches are represented or not, but
That's right, walk-on coaches, avid tutors, those are who are not in the represented unit. Substitutes as well would all be included in there, amongst others, I'm sure.
Okay. Can we get a breakout of those others groups? 'Cause
Certainly.
Seems like a large group.
okay. Yeah, and you might take note, just looking at the revised budget on those others, that the bulk of them have been shifted over to restricted funds. So it looks like it's kind of a 60-40 split, with 40 being on the unrestricted side.
Quick one. So the grand summary here, right, is that the revised budget is 2.36% more than the prior year. And then the projection is another 2%.
Correct.
Is that if I were to look back a few years, 3, 4, 5, 8, is that a number historically that's?
I think that it's typical because that's generally around the total step and column percentage increase. When
Okay.
we build a projection, that's what we build in, a step and column increase.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, so that's certainly a reference for you as we get into deeper discussions. I want to move into just some multi-year financial projection simulations. The first one that we have is our baseline 24-25 first interim report MYP. We've looked at it in the SACS format. We can see it here in the combined format, which is typically presented to the board. This format just combines both restricted and unrestricted and gives us total amounts, but you can see in the far bottom right-hand corner, the reserve amounts at 3.1 out in 26-27. So we're deltaing off of this projection for the simulations looking forward with some changes. So I'm going to flip the page to pro forma 1 is titled up at the top of the page, which incorporates the 27-28 projected year and updates COLAs. As you know, we talked at the last meeting about the reduction of the cost of living adjustment proposed by the state and the governor's January proposal being dropped from 2.93 to 2.43 and that impact and what it was. Further on and after that meeting, we received guidance from school services and the Department of Finance on upgraded COLAs for 26, 27, 27, 28. In your binder package, there's a one-pager here from school services, which is kind of the benchmark in which most school districts, if not all, use when doing projections and the economic factors within.
Regarding COLA, we talk about, you said about a 2% increase when it's step in column, healthcare, PERS. What percentage of COLA, like, so if we got 2% COLA, how much just offsets those increases in personnel with step in column, PERS?
It's obviously dependent upon what your enrollment does. We shared a chart with you. We didn't include it here, but it was in your other package. Talked about a net COLA where as you reduce kids, and the way the COLA works is You can apply it to the number of kids that you have today, but you're not going to get funded till next year, and so the state funds it based on the number of kids you have next year. So, for instance, 1.07% was the COLA this year, and so we were excited about that coming into the year, but we had fewer number of kids. And when we did that calculation, we ended up getting less cash because the number of kids dropped to apply that COLA to. And we've shared that with the board. We'll see what happens moving forward with this projected 2.4% COLA, but in fact, you decline, it's going to be something less. So does it pay for all of step and column? It depends how deep your decrease is and how many staff members you retain.
But about a 1.2% COLA covers the step and column. Just like, well, so we get like, if all of a sudden, oh, we got a 5% COLA, we can raise everyone 5%. We can't do that because we have to cover these costs, and these costs are usually about.
Clearly, there's other variables. There's
About
clearly
2%.
other variables, but step and column is roughly 2%, and it's going to increase. Yeah. And whether the COLA will meet that 2% or not, again, depends on your enrollment and how many staff you still have. Yeah.
Quick question while we're here.
Mm-hmm.
95% of 34,405 is not 33,409. What am I missing here? I've been trying to figure that out for a while.
So the top half of this chart is simply the assumptions, not the actuals.
Okay.
And again,
Three-year rolling average.
yeah. And then you've got, so when you get funded,
Okay.
right, it's a 3-year average, which was provided a couple of years ago by the state.
Yeah. Okay, but the bottom line is the funded number is the 33,409. That's what we're going to get paid on.
Correct.
Gotcha.
Good questions. So as we look at the adjusted COLAs, you can see in 26, 27, 27, 28, we've actually bumped the COLAs up. So that's good news. That gave us some relief on the problem that we were looking at the last board meeting. However, in this simulation with that adjustment and an adjustment for PERS, which is actually ticking up, which is the Public Employees Retirement System, employer contributions are going to increase, and all of your classified are in the PERS system. That will take some money away. So it's a plus and a minus. And so as we move through the numbers, you can see at the end, 27, 28 in the lower right-hand column, the numbers are different than we looked at last meeting, but you're still $260,000 short in your reserve amount, and you have a fund balance of $832,000, which is much shy of roughly $11.5 million that is needed to meet your 2% goal. So some things moved around, but basically the same problem. And you can see that we have now separated on this form the ending fund balance, restricted and unrestricted. Again, have to closely monitor both of them. And in this particular model, it's assumed for the moment that the projection is all restricted funds are exhausted. But for the purpose of what we're doing here, we're really just looking at the unrestricted side. So that rebaselines the model going forward, looking at that fourth year. And so let's get into some simulations about what some reductions might look like, some deficit reductions might look like. And so pro forma 2 is taking where we left off in the conversation last board meeting, $13 million. And if you recall, that simulation said, if we don't do anything, we've got to make a cut in the last year of $13 million. So now we're talking about, well, let's accelerate that cut in this scenario. And again, it's pro forma, it's not a done deal, it just is something to show sensitivity. And so $13 million reduced in 25-26, the next school year, obviously reduces the deficits that you're running significantly. And again, it's an ongoing, which is key in this scenario. And so it's like reducing $13 million in 25-26, and that expense is out in 26-27, and it's also out in 27-28. So it bumps up your reserves significantly, and you can see your ending fund balance goes from $67 million at the beginning to 48.1. Again, quite healthy. But again, all of these reductions would have to be ongoing. So a good picture from the standpoint of addressing budget deficits, a significant reduction at $13 million, And still, at the end of the day, unfortunately, you're deficit spending. And if there is a silver lining to this scenario, besides reducing the nature of the deficit and building and maintaining reserves, it shows that you're growing out of the deficit because of the increased COLAs. You can see the deficit line in 25-26 would be projected to be $7.166 million, but actually gets smaller in 26-27 and gets smaller yet in 27-28. That would all, of course, be dependent on no negative surprises, meaning no additional cost increases or anything like that.
So, a couple of questions about this scenario. So in this scenario, are you assuming no COLA is being passed on to the personnel? So no increases in cost? Is that what your assumption is?
Step and column, which is a contracted cost, is included.
Okay.
But no other salary schedule enhancement is included.
Okay. So looking at the expenditure, why does it reduce from 551 to 538 between 25-26 to 26-27?
Yeah, that is essentially the $13 million cut.
No, the $13 million cut is between the 24-25 to 25-26. So how come there's another
Oh, I'm sorry.
13 million between 25-26 to 26-27?
So the cut comes out in 25-26, right? And then it stays out in 26-27, because it's an ongoing cut.
It's one-time cut. You would assume the expenses to stay flat. You wouldn't assume it. This is saying that you cut another $13 million the second year.
Let me run through it. Yeah, don't have the detail here.
The restricted, expending all the one-time restricted.
Yeah, so this, you're looking at combined amounts, right? And so you have a restricted side here that's in play on 26-27. That's also, the resources there are drying up.
Yeah, so it's the one-time dollars that we currently have spending plans for. The assumption would be that they would be exhausted at the end of 25-26, and so they wouldn't be available to spend in 26-27. So that's why you see that further reduction, but that would be on the restricted side, not the unrestricted.
Okay, so under this scenario, we would still have to make cuts to the restricted programs the second year to realize that further $13 million cut. Is that correct?
Correct. The one-time, either you have to find ways to eliminate the expenses that are covered by one-time dollars, or you have to find ways to cover that in the unrestricted, which, we'll have to make those decisions along the line as well.
Okay, so just to clarify, this scenario is if we made a $13 million cut this school year, and then no additional cuts other than maybe the restricted side where we have to end the program, whatever, no additional cuts for the next 2 years, right? Is that the scenario?
Yeah.
Okay.
And you can see the change on the restricted side going back to the Sachs document I talked about earlier. If you look at the expenditures there in 24, 25, the current year, the expenditures are $211 million, then 25, 26 go to 182, right? And then in 26, 27 go to 176. So that's the restricted side, resources drying up, expenditures being reduced. And so that's why you see it here in the simulation, because it's combined.
Okay, so even if we cut 13 million this year and then status quo the future years, by 2028, we would still be running a deficit.
Correct. Much less deficit, but very manageable deficit, $2.5 million with $40 million in the ending fund balance.
Okay, thank you.
And so looking at that and understanding there's still a significant balance to work with, we said, well, what if we do $10 million? What does that look like? And you can see, as you might expect, obviously the unrestricted deficit gets a little larger as we look at the numbers in bold, net activity unrestricted. You can do the comparisons between the sheets, but you still have in the lower right-hand corner, 27-28, reserve amount of $29.7 million and an unrestricted fund balance of $30.8 million, 5.3% in reserves to meet your 2% requirement. Again, no additional new costs. The COLAs is posted to come through. The enrollment and attendance is posted, come through. And pro forma 4 looks at something even less, $7.5 million. And so, again, same scenario, deficits grow or stay larger, but are much smaller than they are today. And you have ending fund balance that's still significant and can meet your reserves plus. If you look at this scenario at the bottom line, $23 million in the ending fund balance, unrestricted, is more than sufficient to meet your $11.5 million reserve requirement. But you're still running deficits. You did have a bigger issue to tackle going forward. So again, sensitivity on what different cuts would mean if they're all ongoing cuts. To kind of look to the other side of the spectrum, and this is true of any number you plug in, but if you took a $7.5 million cut one time, you still haven't really bought your way out of being qualified in year 4.
Can you remind us what portion of the 11.3 million in cuts from this year were one-time versus ongoing?
If I remember the table, and I don't have it with me, but the vast majority of them I think were ongoing. Not all of them, no. No, there were some one-time cuts, that's for sure.
The $3 million cost savings realized in transportation was one time. But the elimination of the exploration program, shifting that and recreating a VAPA program was ongoing. That was also $3 million. That's just off the top of my head. There were others. More of it to Greg's point.
We can
were-
revisit the chart, and I would suggest when you see second interim in March, that, yeah, you revisit that chart again, and let's see where we're at.
Yeah, more of them were ongoing than one time, but it was a combination of.
Could I just ask a favor, if we could, because I do think it's important to keep our eyes on the absolute numbers, not just the deltas, and you've posted those for the totals, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the next time you show these, if you could, and it's got to be in there, right? It's in the equations in the cells. But if we could show the math, right? For both the combined and the restricted, what is the revenues, and then what is the expenses? Because I like to pay attention to what that absolute number is, and I think it's very important. Thank you.
So in looking at the scenarios, and obviously there's a mixture of things that can be done, and of course none of them are perfect because things will change, and whether it's, a collective bargaining increase that happens during the course of time, whether it's a change in some of the variables that we've plugged in on attendance and enrollment, things will change, but these give you a bit of a sensitivity, and so I think it's important to kind of walk away from just seeing this to understand that, the composition of reductions is really important, right? Your ongoing reductions are going to carry through and buy a lot more than a one-time reduction, but in between those two things are cost shifts. And so you can have what looks like an ongoing cut that maybe you've shifted to a 2-year program that you're just going to have to come back and build back in 2 years. And that's tempting with the block grants, quite frankly. So composition's important. When they're implemented is important. Obviously, sooner is better than later when it comes to reductions. You take the pain, but you reduce the amount you would take if you pushed it out a year or two. I mean, this all comes into your thinking and factoring of how to phase reductions in to get closer to a balanced budget at the end of the day.
So, when we look at this next time, could you come back with one more scenario where we are no longer operating a deficit 3 years out from now? I'd like to consider a scenario where by 2028, we're not in the red anymore. So if you could include that scenario, that would be great. Thank you.
Is that 2027, 28, or 28, 29?
2027, 29,
Okay.
right? Thank you.
Okay, that's what I thought.
And then probably a couple of last comments, thinking about the strategic plan. I know it's exactly what you're all thinking, but I'll just say it for edification. changes in the assumed revenues and expenses, obviously, you've got to pay attention like a hawk, and I know Eric knows this, I know he'll do it, and I know he'll put it forward and share it with you as things change, but it's really important to keep the dots connected on your financial strategy to move through the next couple of years. Because things do change, they look subtle, you may shrug your shoulders, but they can have a large impact through the multi-year projection. Then finally, for the board, it's really about positioning for what you think is going to happen next, right? Whether you see settlements, whether you see attendance perhaps, and we looked at the enrollment and we saw that there's possibility for even bigger drops, right, in certain circumstances, and how you want to gauge that risk and how you want it plugged into these multi-year projections. With that, I would like to go into non-personnel budgets. Any other questions around modeling and financial scenarios? Okay. What we have for you now in terms of departmental budgets are the district departments. You can see there's business support services in the top table, information technology, learning support services, student support services, and on the second page, personnel support services. And so as we look through the current budgets, we see what's budgeted, what the actuals are, what's encumbered or committed, and then pre-encumbered is simply those things that requests or requisitions have been processed for, but they haven't been turned into purchase orders yet. And so it's broken down by department, and I will just kind of go through the summary at the bottom line of each one of the departments in business support services. There's a $6.7 million non-personnel budget. Obviously, it covers a number of departments from payroll to planning, and currently is about 88% committed. So for this year, if you wanted to slow down spending, there's about $800,000 there to work on, but obviously for next year, if there's an interest in reducing non-personnel budgets, there's more information to be told about what all of these costs go for, and we'll get to some of that in just a moment. Information technology, you can see there's a large balance remaining there. I don't have purview of what the plan is, but obviously it's an opportunity to take a look at to try and slow that spending and that remaining balance figure down. Learning support services is more than half expended, again covering a wide variety of projects, and I'm sure a number of those expenditures start getting lined up for prep for next year. So even though they're just over half expended, not committed, they're still probably most likely planned as we prepare for 25-26. Student support services is 80% expended. It's service special education, student support and health services. And then personnel support services are 95% committed. And of course that is personnel commission as well as risk management, so as well as HR. There's plenty of opportunity to drill down on that. It's obviously extensive detail. I know the staff has it prepared and is ready to bring that to you, but for brevity's sake, it's not here today, but we can get into the 5,000s as we discussed, and that would be the next section.
Quick questions. Where would litigation and settlements fall under?
Some of the attorney's fees are in the various departments, but they're kind of buried. We have a summary that we can give to you under separate cover on litigation and settlement fees.
But apart from the attorney fees, what about the actual settlement dollars? Where
Primarily in risk management. Or in special ed, certainly.
So it would be part of the 3.2 risk management total?
Settlements are not budgeted because we didn't really know what they are. There's an allocation, but they're really not budgeted, so you won't see them in these categories. They're separate and outside of this.
Oh, so we don't estimate a settlement, well, I mean, a litigation cost or settlement as part of our budget each year?
Well, yes, we have an allocation, but I wouldn't call it a budget because we don't know what it is.
Okay. And where can I find that allocation line on the budget?
We can give you that under separate cover. It's buried, obviously. I don't have the full budget document here, but we can show it to you. It's it's detailed, and part of it is frankly confidential, so.
So, well, I guess I'm trying to understand, get a magnitude of dollars. Is it in any of the categories we've looked at so far of the charts?
Well, we're looking at very summary level budget charts, so it's buried in there. Certainly in the actuals, and we're budgeted in the budgets.
So I guess let me ask more specific. For example, I was looking at the personnel versus non-personnel expenses. Which category would that fall under?
Let's see. These would be most likely non-personnel. And in HR, yeah, so, yeah. Well, I'm looking for special ed because that's where settlements tend to be. But I'm not sure they're budgeted in these operating units specifically.
Oh, sorry, these are the tables I'm looking at where it breaks out.
Oh, those are-
So in the non-personnel category, is it under other outgoing or other services or?
I'm going to defer to Joy. Did you have a comment on that?
Page 14.
Settlement expense is going to fall under other services because it's a 5,000 object when we are doing the accounting of the expenditures.
So
And
it would
then
be unrestricted side or?
both unrestricted and restricted will have settlement expense. And the detail of the 5,000, you will see it under 58035. There's a unique expense code. So on page 29, there's an amount that's unrestricted. And then on page
There it is.
32, that's restricted, 58035 settlement expense, which is mostly related to special ed.
So the total year-to-date is 126 plus 692, is that correct?
That's correct for combined general fund.
Okay.
And that's the budget, not what's been paid. That's the budget.
Oh,
And
that's
that's
the
budget.
budget.
No,
Correct.
that's budget, yeah,
Correct.
Okay.
but not actual that we have paid. That's just budget.
Do we know if actual is far from the budget or kind of?
It has to be less, but I don't know the actual
Oh, it's less
amount.
than budget.
Yeah,
Okay.
it has to be less.
All right, thank you.
You're welcome.
Or special ed plus other?
It's a good question, but it's restricted general fund, so most likely it's special ed.
Thank you, Joy. Yeah, we've had a preview of the 5,000 expenditures, but they're here listed as budget. Second interim, of course, you'll have an update on all things budget with actuals, and so 5,000s will also be included in that. But you can see from the unrestricted side, total in the 5,000s is $26.7 million. And just looking down through the list, you can see on the front page that we're looking at utilities, as well as dues and memberships and insurance, just various different business operating expenses for the most part.
Yeah, I'll just point out, since you referred to the $3.2-ish million in risk management on a previous page, that's where you see it right there in the insurance cost. It's not settlements, 3.2 million of settlements, it's $3.2 million in insurance.
Yes.
Thank you. And some of these, this report has negative numbers. What do those mean?
Those are amounts owed from other parts of the budget, other programs, or unrestricted. They're call them abatements technically, so they're put in as placeholders because we're going to recoup those costs.
This is the one place where red is good.
Right.
Because
Fair
this is a negative expenditure budget means revenue is coming in, it's offsetting other expenditures.
So is it just a timing issue? We expect it to zero out eventually, or?
Yes, these are intended to zero out in these amounts, and you would see, for instance, at 57-10093, that's a block grant contribution coming back in to the budget. Below that is mental health program, a special ed category, and then learning recovery, emergency block grant contribution at $2.5 million. So we're bringing those restricted funds in to reduce and cover their costs and reduce budgeted expenditures.
Thank you.
Yeah, and probably most significant on this page when I look at ESS, we see $3.3 million coming over just in that single line item from early support services. And the next set is almost $24.7 million in the revised budget. First interim budget is the restricted side. And some of those same programs we just talked about, you see in black numbers, because they're really an expense of the restricted side, coming over to support the unrestricted side. I realize this is fairly summary level detail, but again, as second interim's updated, you'll have not only the summary level information, but certainly, I'm sure staff will be providing detailed information on these larger costs as been requested, so. I will move on to the local control accountability plan, unless there's any other comments or questions on non-personnel budgets. Okay. Booked under your restricted account, the unrestricted account is the local control accountability plan supplemental grants. We usually say supplemental and concentration, but this district doesn't meet the eligibility for concentration grants because the student population is not at the level necessary to qualify for them. But you do receive about $15 million a year through the unrestricted side of the budget for supporting certain students covered under the LCAP. And so those are typically English language learner students, foster care. I think there's one other category that maybe, yes, thank you. So I've cut out an excerpt of what we call the local control funding formula calculator. It's a little bit of an eye chart, but just know that the line in yellow brings that calculation to bear after all the data is entered that shows over the last 4 years your contributions to the LCAP from the unrestricted side is just over $15 million. And this is important because it acts like a restricted program in the unrestricted account. You have to spend the money, you have to spend it on as required, but when you're talking about strategies and determining your priorities, you get to determine what the priorities are and therefore what is supplemental as opposed to core in your district. And so it's an opportunity to take a look and say, oh, look, we have something that's the unrestricted general fund that really is a supplemental for ours, and we can fund it out of the LCAP dollars, which relieves the general fund of that obligation, the discretionary part of the general fund for that obligation. And so it still has to comply with LCAP rules, but it's a little twist within it that is worth noting because you get to choose as you build your LCAP plan with the community. And you can see currently what is in your LCAP plan on the following pages. I won't belabor it. It's typically drawn up through LSS with the community input and adopted at the budget adoption period. But you can see the types of amounts and what's being supported through this $15 million. And as you go through that planning, if you find your LCAP supplemental program is perhaps not as you'd like it to be or serving the community as you'd like it to be, then you can take a look at what you may be doing and reclassify it to bring it in to better serve the community while expensing these dollars. Conversely, if you make a reduction to the LCAP, to an LCAP cost as an unrestricted savings, you don't really get to save the money unless you put something else in its place, because you have to spend the dollars. It's a little convoluted, but if there's any questions, I'm sure I can help you with that, and this ties out to your current plan.
Sorry, can you say that one more time? So you say that we can only use this $15 million if it's categorized as supplemental.
So it's a supplemental grant that you can use for students that are identified in your LCAP. And you have to spend the dollars.
Right.
But it's on the unrestricted side. So when we look at the unrestricted side, we think, oh, that's all discretionary dollars. This little chunk is not.
Right, but you said something about we have some discretion in determining if it's core versus supplemental.
Yes, you do.
And how does that affect whether or not we can spend the money? It has to be under supplemental?
Yes. It has to be outside of your core program. It has to be something extra.
Okay. And how is that, is there some sort of guideline that says this definition is core, this definition is supplemental?
Well, there's a guideline. The county oversees what you call supplemental, and I know LSS is in close contact with them because they audit your plan and take a look at it. Some counties are more flexible than others, but I would encourage you to look at the LCAP plan and have a discussion around the things that you see here in retrospect to, you're going to have to condense to potentially reprioritize. Maybe you look at the list and say, no, this is all supplemental stuff. None of it's in our core, but when you see counselors, for instance, you have them in your core and you have them in your supplemental. So what is your basis for staffing counselors? Well, certainly a portion of them are supplemental. Could more of them be supplemental? Perhaps.
But we only have 15 million to work with, and we're already accounting for all 15 million, right?
Right.
It's not like we have additional room that we can play with.
Right, but you have similar expenses within your discretionary general fund that if you wanted to move more of them into a supplemental category after looking at them and evaluating them and verifying that, yes, we want to call this supplemental because we can't afford them in the core, then you can pay for them out of LCAP.
But then we have to remove according dollars from the
Something
current
else,
supplement.
and you may look at your plan and say, oh, okay, we've met the community's need with this particular initiative, and that drops out as a priority.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I'm sure there'll be more discussion on LCAP planning as it comes about in the next couple of months and boils up. Yeah, I know it's starting in the district and coming forward. Let's take a look at one-time funds, the allocations and uses. As I mentioned earlier, school districts across the country and certainly California, have been inundated with one-time funds, and one-time funds are a problem because you get them in a big chunk. They sit in your general fund until you can swallow them, plan for them, and they show up as a deficit in your general fund budget. But Poway has had quite an extensive amount of funds. This particular table goes through the pandemic funding and talks about the different categories that were received top to bottom, COVID funding, resources. And you can see that there's $81 million and change that was provided to Poway and has been expensed as of the first 3 months of this year over the course of several years. So those dollars are expensed, but they're here for the record, and so we share them with you. What is currently active in one-time funding is the Arts and Music Instructional Block Grant. You can see that allocation is $21.3 million. And if we spool over, we can see that the budget for 24-25 is $9.4 million. And the remainder is 3.643, which is anticipated to be expensed next year. Now, these have all been programmed. The question is, are they programmed in the right manner now that you know you're looking at deficit reduction? So that's a conversation. And the point is that if dollars can be used to relieve the general fund while still accomplishing priorities of the board and the district, then perhaps you can reprogram and take at least a temporary benefit from unburdening the general fund and maintaining a balance in the ending fund.
So these one-time funds, there is discretion on how you can spend it, or they have to be spent on those categories?
A couple of them have much broader discretion than a couple of the others. For instance, the Arts and Music Instructional Materials Block Grant, although titled that, has fairly wide discretion. The Learning Recovery Block Grant has fairly wide discretion. Educator Effectiveness, less discretion, but focused on education instructional programs, where you spend unrestricted general fund money. So it's not as though it rules out the use of current resources by using these instead. In the AGG Improvement Block Grant, we've listed it, but we expect there'll only be $250,000 left as we finish this year, so it's about expiring. And again, as I mentioned, you see the footnote on the chart. In our multi-year projection, we're anticipating that the ending fund balance on the restricted side, which is where this is all book kept, is going to be $11.8 million. And outside of the $8 million in carryover for one-time grants, there's another $3.5 million that we've talked about that are generally restricted, lottery, and any maintenance carryover.
Just want to verify, when you're talking about possible reallocation of any of these grants that we have already budgeted and approved as a board in the past, any savings that we move over would be one time,
It would.
much less useful. And we know that what we budgeted them for already is very useful. We've approved it multiple times.
Right. Very good. It is a tool, but yeah, if you're committed to your priorities, you're committed to your priorities, and you will not have that ability. But if in fact you look and go and you see something that says, well, my priorities have changed.
So this $8.3 million, is it accounted for already in your scenarios?
Yes. To be expensed in the next year.
Okay, so I mean, they've already been spent in your scenarios, essentially? Okay, thanks.
And so the detail on each one of those grants and how they've been spent year by year with some description of what is being supported is provided. Just looking at the Arts, Music, Instructional Materials Block Grant, you can see expenditures rolling across the year at the bottom of the page, 3.1 million, 5.1 million. We're currently in 24-25, and we have 9.4 million with a current balance of 5.6 unspent. And then that rolls out, and it looks like if that's all expensed, we would then spend $3.6 million budget and spend 3.6 next year to exhaust that grant. Similar, the emergency block grant, learning recovery emergency block grant follows that. I won't repeat the numbers, but you can see how that plays out to expense the total allocation of $14.2 million, $263 million. And then the educator effectiveness block grant is next. And what is really a bit of history now on the A to G improvement block grant. As you know, the governor proposed potentially another block grant coming forward, one-time money. It's exciting. I would encourage the district to keep a sharp eye on that because those things tend to get beat up pretty good through the legislative session, and they don't often come out exactly as intended in the January budget. So
But it was good to see that the governor decided that those were going to be by ADA and not based on supplemental concentration,
Yes.
unduplicated numbers.
Let's hope it stays that way for
Because we would
Paladin.
lose, and
Correct.
by ADA, we're right in the mix.
Any questions or comments on grants individually or collectively? I want to share with you the next chart that talks about the influence of, as these grants dry up, there are people attached to them.
Sorry, can we go back one
Sure.
more page? I'm looking at what we just went, yeah, that. So for the arts and music, I see, it seems like the biggest chunk that we have not spent is the VAPA expenses. So is that on track to be spent this year?
So I'm glad you asked, because we have some VAPA work that has been, that is in the process of being contracted to improve facilities for performing arts. And happy to say that the bid for that job looks like it's coming in less than we expected, and there'll be some savings there.
But we do anticipate spending it in this school year.
If there's savings, it's currently unplanned on what that savings might be spent for.
But the work we anticipate will complete this year.
Correct,
Okay,
yes.
thank you.
And I'm sure there'll be an update on that at second interim as well, so you'll get a better picture of what may be available there that's not to be expensed. Could be replanned.
But do we have the savings of the specialist, that's in a hiring freeze, correct? James?
That's correct. We have not posted that position since it became vacant.
Moving to the last chart, and this is really a planning chart for the most part, but as I mentioned, people are attached to these grants, employees, and so the plan, at least right now, and this is supporting growth in your unrestricted deficit, is as these grants dry up, potential to move people back over into the unrestricted funding, to be supported by unrestricted funding. The plan is laid out in this last chart, and you can see in 24-25, from the Learning Recovery Grant, we moved a counselor and executive assistant over off of the restricted programs onto the unrestricted side as those program plans were tweaked a bit. 25-26, looks like there's 5 elementary music teachers to be moved over into the unrestricted general fund is the plan, and some additional expenses. And then certainly in 26-27, as these funds dry up, in 27-28, more staff would be moved over in the absence of other funding sources.
So,
I've been asked, oh, sorry, I'll let you finish the comment, and then before we move on to the next section, we're going to take a little break. So if you have a question you want to ask first, then we'll.
yeah, just so I'm understanding this properly. So grants, one-time funds, they got expended. That's the first page. The last one is basically saying, here are the people tied to those programs, and here's the future costs associated with those people that are still implementing these programs.
Moving into the unrestricted general fund, yes.
And that is in the current pro formas
Yes,
on the unrestricted side.
yes.
I gotcha. Thank you.
Okay.
All right, so let's take a 5-minute break. It is 5:44. We'll resume in about 5 minutes. Thanks. At 5:50. Greg, you're up.
All right, here we go. Let's see, we're on section 3E, which is special education funding and staffing. We've got to really thank Stacy, who's the director, executive director, special ed, really helpful in pulling data together, as well as our finance team. We'll go finance first, so. Chart up on the screen, chart in front of you is 2019-25 special education program revenues and expense summary. So this chart reflects in the summary level the revenue sources to fund special ed, which are AB 602 funds, which potentially are primarily a pass-through federal government, state to the district. And you can see, looking through this chunk of revenues, that it's grown from roughly $20.5 million in 2019-20 to $31.5 million in 24-25. There have been years where the state has not given a cost of living increase to special ed funding, but most recently it seems like they're on board with it, so that's good news. There are also a number of categorical grants that fund special ed, and you can see as you look through that line, they too have increased over time. As of this year, they're at a $15 million level. And unrestricted local grants also contribute almost $11 million, $10.7 million is the expectation for revenues in first interim for that. So in total, the revenue picture for special education is $57.25 million. Now that is stark in contrast to, and I'm sure some has rolled their eyes down to the next page on the far right, where it talks about total expenses at $126 million. And you can see how those are charged off. Obviously, the categorical expenditures, the unrestricted expenditures, all align with categorical and local grants. But the all-resource line, 6,500, which is where we bookkeep most of the special ed dollars, is $100 million. So how does that get funded? Well, that gets funded through your unrestricted general fund, and you see in contributions, and we'll look at it another way in a moment, but we'll see those dollars come over from the unrestricted general fund. The difference between revenues and expenditures move over from the unrestricted discretionary side of the ledger. And this year we're expecting $68.8 million, slightly less than what we budgeted, which is good news, but in fact more than was last year's actual. And as you can see, that's grown from $47.8 million to an expected $68.8 million contribution. And so that increases there. Clearly, revenues do not keep up special ed expenses. Just to add to it, and you'll note the footnote, there are some special ed related costs that are book kept outside of 6,500, including transportation. We also moved previously, the district moved things that were funded in COVID and health services have been moved, as well as bus aids were recently moved to transportation in order to collect reimbursement from the state for bus aids. Not 100% reimbursement, but something that's better than nothing. So those 20 or so bus aids are in that bookkeeping. So that's the big financial view of special education as we see it today. Again, update coming at second interim. Just to kind of break down the two smaller pieces of revenues and expenses, you can see the charges historically for the $10 million bucket, the unrestricted expenses, which are another form of dollars allocated out of your discretionary resources to support special education. And you see that totals at $10.7 million, consistent with the adopted budget, but a $1.3 million increase from last year's actuals.
Sorry, what do units 324 and 338 mean?
Those are separate bookkeeping units, or operational units, I should say. And so they've just, the services of health services, which is 338, and any expenditures, including psychologists, have been moved around, and you can actually see that in these next charts.
So this $10.7 million includes what?
So that's the chart on the next chart.
Okay.
And so you see the resource number that it's book kept, and I will tell you, so 000, the top line, $1.8 million is discretionary dollars. So that can be used for supplies and resources, hourly support, whatever you'd like, in the special ed program. But when you get down to resource 514120, that's where the psychs have been moved to, and you see that that has increased from 4.6 to $6.5 million. And health services, which is the following resource, 514338, from 2020 has grown from $750,000 now to $1.4 million. So those are the big shifts and expenditures for the unrestricted expenditures. I'm sorry? Sure.
I had just two quick ones. Is there a reason why you started at 2019-20? Is that like significance or just where the page allowed?
No, that's just the data that was close at hand. Yeah.
It's fine. And then to summarize simply here, the difference between the 126 million and 57 million is the 68, right? And that is funded by the unrestricted side of the budget.
That's your contribution.
Gotcha.
To Heather's previous question, the column ending in 120 was the psychologists, and what was the other column that you mentioned?
Column, the row
row,
just below
sorry.
that, 338, is health services.
Thank you.
Sorry, I probably missed this. So what's special about the 10.7 million on this page? What versus the other?
So it's been a budget that's been set up out of the unrestricted side to support special education.
Oh,
and
that's
it has-
unrestricted.
Yeah, it has
Okay.
its annual allocation, and so this is how that is, to use a term, getting soaked up.
Thank you.
And then when we look at the state, or categorical expenditures, which are primarily state, but I believe there's probably some federal in here as well, you can see how those are used. And again, these are allocated. They need to be used every year. We use them to the maximum amount possible. And so those are increased. I will point out a couple of orange lines here, particularly in this chart. 6128 is a resource for early education. It's an expansion grant. It's given to us by the state, and so we're using that for the first time this year to the tune of $1.6 million. And you can see kind of the historical context. We're back at a level we were in 22-23 in the total amount of these grants and utilization. And you'll notice in yellow on the lower line, the below the total and before the adjusted total is funding from previous pandemic grants. And obviously they've finished now, and you can see the bulk of those, as noted in yellow, have been shifted, and as we mentioned before, shifted into 3338 for health services, and which is nursing and hourly nurses and psychologists, as I mentioned earlier, have been moved as well.
And this page is restricted or unrestricted?
Well, it's restricted, yeah. All special ed is restricted except for the contribution and the prior page, which is unrestricted. So every year, the dance on how to fund, not just special education, but almost any program that where we have a program and perhaps resources come in lower than expected, turns into a dance of where do we go to fund this? Because, as you know, we have very strict requirements about how we reduce staff and replan. The next chart is just a little different cut. It comes out of a different reporting, and it is a Special Education Program Goal 5000 series, and is actually in a different system. So the bottom line totals don't match because this particular system doesn't count certain types of expenditures. So you see the total special education expenditure in the blue line, 3/4 of the way down the page, 120 million.76, and that's an increase. But probably more importantly is the CalPADS data on the top line, which captures in your CalPADS system all of the students that are flagged with an IEP. So regardless of what special ed need they have, they're flagged so we know. And so when we look at first interim, we can see that there are 5,238 students in the Poway School District that have a special ed designation in the CalPAD system. You can see that's up from 2010 or 2019-20. There was a higher actual in 23-24, but that's come down, so that service is rendered and should be good news.
So does this number have any effect on revenue, the top line number?
Yeah, the formula for both state and federal dollars is derived off of special education students, but it's not fully funded. The bigger impact is more students you have, the more your contributions are likely to become.
Mm-hmm. So I guess what's the impact of the 5238 versus the 5628 that we adopted? There's some sort of revenue shortfall?
Well, revenue is not going to be as much as it was when it was 5,600 students. Yeah, and expenses won't either, at least in theory, but we're growing expenses, so.
The largest piece of state funding, which on a prior slide was called AB 602, that's actually allocated to districts on a district-wide per ADA basis. And so that's been one of the funding conundrums that we've had in the state. The identification of students with disabilities has been increasing over the years, pre-pandemic, including after pandemic. Meanwhile, we're funded on a per ADA basis, which is declining across the state and declining in this district. So those lines are going in the opposite direction. Fortunately, the state has provided more per student funding over the last few years, and they have had a commitment to increasing that. But as you can see from the contribution that we're making from the unrestricted, it's not keeping up with the overall decline in funding specifically for special education.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, we'll go to contributions first, and then we have some notes on staffing, just following that. So again, below in the SACS charts in your financial reports that you see, obviously you have operations, and then there's a segment toward the bottom of the page that talks about contributions and transfers. So we want to capture here what that means, and so this is a summary of the contributions going back to 2019. And you can see really there's just 3 or 4 programs that have been involved in contributions, special ed being the significant part, and this is the mechanism by which we transfer over from the unrestricted side to the restricted side to cover that difference between restricted revenues received and expenses charged for special education. And so you see that same $68.8 million number in the 24-25 column. You can follow it historically here. But also in that contributions is your routine restricted maintenance. The state keeps us bookkeeping through the state accounting guide to bookkeep that on the restricted side of the ledger. And we have to move money from the unrestricted side to the restricted side to cover it.
But there's no restricted revenue that covers it?
There's not, no.
How does that?
So it probably goes back in history where the state basically said to your facilities, you go figure out how to support your facilities. But they did adopt a rule that said if you want to be eligible for state grants, you have to fund 3% of your operating expenditures and budget them for routine restricted maintenance, because the theory was we don't want to give you state money and not have you take care of your facilities. And so we budget that out of the unrestricted side. The accounting is collected on the restricted side. The money is then transferred over to cover the cost. And we have a transition partnership grant that you can see is, takes about $80,000 from the unrestricted side. The total program's around $300,000, but we get reimbursement from the Department of Rehabilitation on this program to the tune of $200,000 or so. And with that, that's really the contribution. So when you see that big number down at the bottom of the chart, you can see, you know what it is representing. There's a couple of expenditure pages to see how those charges are documented and then how they're moved over in the contributions. I don't know that I need to belabor this. It's obviously a bigger picture than just the contributions. But they're resource 6500, and then the workability program is resource 3410. And then routine restricted maintenance, the bookkeeping for that in summary is here as well.
Question about, not this page, but the previous page?
Mm-hmm.
And one more up? Oh, yeah. So the contracted services line, is that the outsourcing of the IAs, or is that something else?
Yeah, most likely, any outside employment's going to be under contracted services.
It'll be all, that earlier sheet where we had all of the 5,000s listed, it would be any of those services that are specifically tied to special education. So it would be non-public schools, it would be non-public agencies, legal fees are really the three largest that you would see in contracted services for special education.
And so I remember, I think, was it from the board journal? We're projecting significantly less than what we budgeted. And so what are we budgeting, what are we forecast, I guess I'm asking what's in the scenarios? Are we forecasting a further decline in that, or are we forecasting status quo?
We're forecasting growth in special ed, consistent with what it has been the last couple of years. There's a lot of work going into trying to understand strategies for containing the growth in that. But as you give step and column increases, you'll have some growth. Should you have new, depending upon their services, new students come into the district, you could have some growth. It is an open door in a sense that, you know, you don't really control the costs in special ed as much as you can, because you want to provide the services to the most needy students in your district. But there are some options, and we'll look at where the district currently is, where you might want to look at trying to contain costs in a minute.
What I would say about a multi-year projection is it takes the current year as the baseline and it projects things forward based off of what we know today. If we get into our budget development cycle in the spring and we see that we're spending less on certain contracted services, that adjusts the baseline down for next year because we could capture those savings if we believe they're going to hold. And then that would lower the projection on that one line item in the future years. So it's always going to be continually adjusted based off of known factors, as you've seen from Mr. Magnuson today and over the last few months. Any of the projections are going to be based off of the current year budget that haven't captured maybe potential savings that we've already found this year.
Right. Thank you. So the reason I brought that up is I think we talked, I mean, the past board meetings as well, people have talked about the IAs and whatnot. And so that's why I thought maybe we are projecting at least a flat or declining in contracted services if we believe we can fix that situation. But it sounds like currently we're projecting a growth in that area.
As a total program, we are, yes. And again, that's going to get calibrated through the next 5 months in the budget development process. There was a recent job fair. I understand that maybe some IAs are coming out of that, so that'll be a development project as part of the budget.
Yeah, the growth that you might see in materials, supplies, and other services in the projections would be adjustments for inflation and what we believe, and so we account for that to say, okay, the program that we have built today that includes these services and supplies will get X% more expensive next year, and so we're going to build that assumption in, and if we need to pull it back because we can't afford it, we do that. But at least when you're looking out into the future, you're saying, all things being equal, this program is going to be slightly more expensive. So, you know, the long story short, you know, as of right now, the projections that you would see would be based off of the adopted budget, first interim budget, and how we had the programs built and how we assume that they would move into future years. As we work through budget development, if there are any changes, pluses or minuses across the board, those get built in, and then that adjusts the multi-year projection in the future years by those plus or minus amounts.
I wanted to respond to the question I heard you ask about non-public agency staff, or at least I think you did, referenced in Board Journal. We had a high watermark of 85 non-public agency staff that we hired. This year, we have kept that number at 30 or below. That has generated from December to December a $3 million savings. So that's what I wrote in Board Journal, and that, I think, it's not the entirety of the story of a flat number here, but it's certainly evidence that as we distance ourselves from the pandemic and as we successfully hire new staff, and you saw in the news, if you haven't seen in the Palmerado News, there's a great article on the hiring fair we had the day after Rebecca Lee's report that Thursday night to the board, the most successful we've ever had, the largest number of people we've ever hired, right? Those types of outcomes will help us more fiscally and efficiently, right, run this district in a way that will cost less over time.
Greg, what is the 500,000 indirect cost? Do you have any idea?
Which page are you referring to? Oh, okay.
On the special ed page still?
Right, so that's going to be an expense out for charges levied by the district for various overhead things. Every program comes with an indirect cost calculation. Special ed is included in that. Yeah. And you can tell it's a very round number, so they'll do the calculation as we get to the end of the year and true that number up into something.
It's not a catch-all, it's a formula that's driven by the actual expenditures, and yes, it does cover district-wide overhead.
Yes. So
I just was
catch-all in
looking,
that
I was
sense.
like, I'm like, one year it's 57,000 and the next year it's 300,000 and then it's $500,000. I just was curious.
That number will be whatever it is calculated to be, it's not arbitrary.
Okay.
Oh, Joy wants to. Joy's got some insight for us.
Can we get the real story?
I apologize, the description of the expense is incorrect.
Thank you.
That is actually other tuition payment we pay to the county for our students going to SDCOE. That's not indirect cost. We don't charge indirect costs to special ed. We contribute.
Thank you for straightening us out on that.
I was actually wondering why we did that, thank you.
Now we know. Okay, let's see, we're on to transfers, unless somebody has questions about restricted maintenance or any further questions on special ed. So transfers out, you can see basically all of the transfers out are linked to what we call OPEB, which is other post-employment benefits. Every district carries a liability for other post-employment benefits. It's accrued over time for its employee base. It's captured in our audit. A few years ago, there was an audit change that made us declare that as a part of our financials. And so to fund that over time, there's a contribution that comes from the district into, I believe it's Fund 63 or 67, to contribute to reducing that liability. There is an opportunity to take a pause in that contribution if the board is interested in doing that as a part of its deficit reduction strategy.
Greg, sorry, can we go back one slide? We have no idea what this means. What is restricted maintenance for people? What does that mean?
Restricted maintenance for people.
Like the whole 8150, when I hear maintenance, I think buildings and stuff, but
Okay, so when you say for
Well, you have classified and benefits, so what's maintenance on classified and benefits?
Those are the employees that do the maintenance. So the 3% that you're spending on your maintenance program includes our maintenance staff who are performing the work in addition to the supplies, and I'm not sure that was me. Okay.
Yes, so, right, so classified benefits, everybody on the maintenance staff is classified personnel, there are no certificated, so everybody from the plumber, painter, electrician, up into the office staff is captured here.
Oh, and they're restricted because of what you said earlier about the facilities, is that right?
Right, and yes, the California State Accounting Code says we've got to bookkeep them on the restricted side.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to move on to kind of class size. So just as reference, I've included the certificated class size staffing article from the contract, as well as the MOU we're operating under. Staff is just now beginning for next year to start to estimate the number of staff that are needed based on enrollment. And so in summary tables, you want to click through the language. We'll go through that specifically. We'll capture it here on the table. Staffing ratios for various grade levels are noted. You'll see one in bold for grades 4 and 5. You'll notice that it says 31-1. That is not the real staffing level. That is what we use for a planning tool for unrestricted. It actually is 29-1 because we augment the reduction and buy down using one-time grants to fund the lower class size for grade 4 and 5. But at least for now in the staffing, looking at unrestricted, that's the plan, and then to come back and buy it down with restricted funds. Is that fairly clear? In other words, the Learning Recovery Emergency Block Grant is buying enough teachers to buy down the student ratio from 31 to 29.
But the agreement with the PFT is 29.
Correct. So we get to 29, just use multiple funding sources to do it. And understanding that block grant will soon expire, there'll have to be another source for that. And you can see that in the position table that said, here's how we're going to move folks over. There were teachers listed there.
Which grades?
Grades 4 and 5. And so this is just a flavor, just so you can see, and again, eye chart, but this is a breakdown of the initial staffing projection. I'll say incomplete because it'll go through several other iterations, but we have on the right side or middle of the tables for elementary schools, the 24-25 enrollment by grade level, enrollment at month 5, and then the calculated teacher FTE that's necessary to support that. So you can see at the elementary, if you go to the bottom line, 601.8 students, or 601.8 FTE are dedicated to elementary core instruction. You can see the staffing ratios at 24.9, even I have trouble reading that. Next year, that first pass, that number changes just a little bit. But this number will be trued up as you go through further budget development and some more local enrollment calculations. But as first blush, it's a reference point as you discuss it further and you discuss class sizes further. Middle schools, same drill with that, and you can see that 266 plus teachers are in place supporting middle schools currently in 24-25. And that number changes very little as you move to 25-26. In the current projection, there's a gain of 31 students there. And at high schools, well, you can follow the drill there. There's 10,000 and change in the number of students currently there with, looks like 541 teachers in place. I'm sorry, 300. Yeah, 341. And so as we move to next year, number changes just incrementally, 7 additional students moved over again, first cut at looking at staffing enrollment on the general education side. Alternative programs is listed as well, and you can see from that chart that we maintain the existing enrollment in 24-25 and carry that over as a planning tool for 25-26, but ultimately that'll be adjusted as we know more and get closer to enrollment for next year. So these are the planning numbers. Obviously, through conversations, any changes in class sizes and any grade level, I think will probably be discussed as a part of deficit reduction strategy, but this is a baseline take on where we're at today, and at least where planning is using the same numbers going forward.
Sorry, can we go back one page? I know it's really hard to see. I'm using my magnifying glass, but for example, the middle school, does that say that our current student teacher is, well, which number is the actual current teacher student?
So these are the planning numbers.
Okay.
Right, and these two tables are planning numbers based on, and the bottom is the 24-25 MOU numbers in agreement with PFT. The actual numbers are in 24-25 on the tables that show kind of where we're at in terms of staffing.
Okay, so the current actual is 28.8 for middle school, but under our proposed budget or planning, it will be right at 29.
29, yes.
Which is the agreed number.
Yeah, which is
Okay.
pretty darn close for taking that number of students across that many grade levels and at different sites to get there.
Maybe you just answered this, and I'm not putting it together, but these numbers here, is this the numbers that's used in the budgets that we've seen this thus far?
Yes, they're captured in the actuals certainly for this year, and they're carried through.
Okay, so this is what's in there.
Right.
Okay.
So any
Thanks.
changes would be obviously.
First in term, all the way through the first in term.
Correct.
Okay, thanks.
I'm noticing there, just a few of these are sticking out to me, particularly in the alternative programs. These student-teacher ratio column is quite different from what the SARCs listed.
Oh, that's interesting.
I'm wondering, okay, so you don't have an explanation
I
for
do
that.
not. I
Okay.
do not. We have actuals.
Well, we just
with
approved those
the
last
math.
month, and those numbers were
Well, and the SARCs are a
different.
year trailing, so those
So a
numbers may
year
be.
ago, it was that different, because it's significant.
Is it?
Oh, yeah.
Interesting.
Okay, I'm interested in that.
Okay, well, there's a little reconciliation perhaps maybe to take a look at there. Final page in staffing, and I mentioned we'd kind of get to special education staffing. So done, and this is a bit of my work, if you will, just looking at caseloads based on information provided from the special education department. Knowing that special education is a big lever in the district and a big part of the budget. These are the categories, and so the first table looks at a summary level at teachers. The second table looks at instructional assistant staffing. And so when we consider the two main classes or caseloads associated with special education, we talk about SIA, RSP, and then we divide them by elementary and secondary. When we talk about RSP, the state caseload maximum is 28 per teacher. Try to reflect here the number of students that you have in either secondary or elementary, looking at the teacher FTE, as I understand it, that are assigned, and then calculating an average caseload. So you can see at the elementary level for RSP, your average caseload is just under 23. And for RSP secondary, it is just under 19 for an average district-wide of 20. The next couple of columns do some quick simulations that said, well, if you were to staff at 24, 26, or 28, what would that do to the FTE calculation at either one of those? And so you can see there's not a lot of impact at elementary, given that they're already at 23, but at secondary, the impact could be significant if you chose to move the caseloads to a higher level. And so those numbers represent FTEs that would not be required with higher caseloads. Questions on that before I move down into SDC?
Sorry, I'm trying to make sure I read this correctly. So if we were to follow the state maximum, this chart shows that we would have a reduction of 51.4 FTE. Is that what it shows? Okay. Thank you.
And that's just the math on it. Obviously, there'd be some rounding because you have different sites and capacities, but yes. Okay. Moving down to SDC. Again, same drill, max caseload roughly 15. Students currently in SDC. Again, divided by two segments of SDC, which is structured support and extensive, which is mild, moderate, and extensive, moderate, severe and extensive, mild, moderate, and structured support. And so we look at the FTE that's assigned, and we look at what the average caseloads are, and as you can see at the elementary level in structured support, you're at 12.2. In the secondary, you're at 13 for an average 12.3. Again, same drill, so if you staffed at 12, not really any change there, except you might actually drop in the secondary, or need more staff in the secondary. If you went to 15, there's marginal or incremental change in the number of teachers that would be necessary, at least as a math problem. And then looking at SDC and extensive, you can see some variation there as you move through it with the current enrollments. The average caseload is 8 in elementary, 10.8 in extensive, and these are obviously the most severe students. But if you went to state maximums, there's a little bit of margin there, not a lot, but it's very difficult to gauge. So, but there is potential. And then we look at it, instructional assistant staffing. RSP doesn't have a requirement that I'm aware of, except maybe under some certain circumstances, so I've left that for now and just worked with SDC because it's pretty clear. We've had a conversation with special ed staff. You know, the minimum required in a class of 15, 2 instructional aides, and again, this is not discounting, but is independent of severity and needs for additional adults in the room, but with a teacher, and 2 aides is kind of the typical maximum or minimum in the state. Currently, you're staffed at a teacher plus 4 for structured support elementary, and then 3 for the other categories. If you were to drop 1 aide per class, you can kind of see how that works out in the SDC world. Again, independent of considerations for severe or special, highly special needs students. So there's some margin there that, again, you can work with. Questions on special ed staffing?
So the top category is teacher, and how, what is the PFT agreement for these teachers? Does it fall under the same ratios as the previous ones?
The PFT contract doesn't cover special ed, so we default to the state minimums, or minimums and maximums.
Okay, thank you.
And of course, past practice to a bit. Other questions? All right, moving on along to section 5. I think we're at least getting close to kind of summing up here. And so, as mentioned, we thought we would close with just kind of looking back and reminding for those that are interested on, you know, what a fair share might look like. These exercises in deficit reduction and making reductions in the budget are never fun, and they're never, well, everybody has different priorities, and the role of the board and administration is to come some sense of rational approach on reduction, fair share being at least a going-in position after or before accounting for maybe specific priorities in any areas. And so this model was put together when we adopted the budget, just to give a sense looking forward to 25, 26, as it was projected at that point, on what the various pieces of the wedges are that contribute to the unrestricted general fund and would relieve its deficit if affected with deficit reduction. So those are the wedges of the pie and the amounts that were presented at that time. And if we took that and took a look at a model and said, yeah, we wanted to adhere specifically to it, and we wanted to cut 1% or 3%, it gives you some dollar values to get to, in the case of 3%, $13.8 million with relative cuts equal in percentage share across the board. The next column is a modified version of that, whereas you could take perhaps some smaller or larger reductions in non-personnel to get to a higher number, but if you wanted to stay at $13 million, you could reduce with those higher non-personnel costs or reductions, you could reduce the personnel categories. That's another chart and another look at it. But anyway, a model for consideration, and I know as you work through this issue, you'll be looking at how does it affect different groups, how does it affect not only our priorities, but the things that we do that we believe in that may not be of the highest priority, but are important to us. So a little bit of a guidepost to reflect back on what if, how close is our approach to a fair share approach, or how far away is it from it? Again, it's about equity often in school districts, and I'll just leave it at that. The final chart is just, again, to remind ourselves of the dates that are coming up. We're here at the board workshop on the 6th. The intent is to have something preliminary between the administration and the board that will help guide direction on any reductions that are made, working through to second interim and any deadlines that need to be met for notifications of employees. The real grinding work obviously gets to March through May, where you need to really lock down what you're going to do, and to the extent that it may affect employees, there of course is a May date in which you need to make those decisions. So you've got the runway to do that. We've given you some information that you can work with at a, not only conceptual level, but at a summary level to begin to jointly discuss proposals and initiatives that might be of interest to any one person, but hopefully to get to proposals and initiatives that the group can build consensus on in the backdrop of how fast and how far you want to go, given that you have available reserves to give you some time to smooth the landing, if you will, for this venture. With that, I thank you for listening to me for this extended time. It's been a pleasure to serve the Poway Unified School District. Although just a bit over 4 months in, I hope I captured a lot of what's going on here, and I could only do that with the help of the staff in our business department. And you're going to be in good hands, of course, with Eric, Dr. Churchill, and the staff. And thank you to Cabinet for you welcoming here and participating in the development of my learning and knowledge to try and get up to speed and bring hopefully some experience to bear on your current conditions. So thank you to the board as well.
Just a quick one. What, this little insert in here, was this part of what? Or
Yes,
just for
I mentioned
later,
this briefly. I didn't
did?
go through it, but
Sorry.
I can if you would like. But
No, just.
this is known across the industry as the school services dartboard. And school services, after the governor's budget, produces a dartboard that says, here's economic factors that school districts want to pay attention to in their planning going forward based on the tea leaves of what the governor, the Department of Finance, and to a certain extent what school services thinks. It is a standard that's been in place in districts for more than 40 years. And so it's provided for yours. It'll be updated at second interim too, I'm sure.
Thank you so much. There was a lot here, and I appreciate everyone who contributed to this. I have a feeling you have some things to say, Ben.
Nope.
No? You just sat back. I don't think so.
Yes, but. I guess at this point, and thank you to Greg, and thank you to the fiscal services team, all of BSS, and PSS, and in fact, all of our divisions had a large role to play in pulling all this together. We are now going to embark on what some potential reduction strategies might look like over the next few weeks and certainly months. I took a bunch of notes from things that board members said this evening, so that we have a sense of some upcoming to-dos. When we think about how to bring back to you a portfolio of reduction strategies, we'll think about two sorts of things. On the one side, certainly, we want to look at any opportunities to increase revenue. Those are certainly going to be part of our overall strategy, but we can't rely on those exclusively to get where we need to go. There are a number of things that I've heard mentioned here tonight and mentioned in other venues that fall on the revenue side. We've had conversation with folks about OCIS, the short-term independent study contracts, and recouping some ADA by going through that process. We think that'll be important as we move forward. There's the possibility of billing for Medi-Cal, Medicaid reimbursements through our special education department. That will likely bring in some additional revenue. There's certainly things to look at, like our facility rentals, like our unused space, that may, in fact, result in additional revenue. And so that's all positive. That's not an exclusive list. There are other things. But I think it's important to note that that's not going to be how we ultimately land on a number. We're going to have to look at things like core staffing. We'll have to take a look at how do we refine our inclusive practices programs so that we're both more efficient and more effective in meeting the needs of students. So more to come there. We've heard suggestions about looking at things like our software and our subscriptions. Absolutely, that has to be something we dig into. Looking through our department budgets, looking at our joint use agreements. Taking a look at things like our OPEB contributions and whether or not there's some room to pause there. And then certainly part of my charge will be looking at a larger district office reorganization to both become more lean and more effective in terms of how we here in this building support the operations at all the school sites. Again, with students at the center, our most critical mission is meeting the needs of kids and meeting the expectations of our community. So we're going to continue to work through all of that. I think some of the initial conversation from the board has been very helpful. And I guess, I would just close with asking if board members have additional thoughts, comments, concerns, or questions for us to think through as we're pulling something together to bring to you at our next couple of board meetings.
I have a comment. I'll give everyone a chance too. But, you had the scenarios where you're going to cut 7.5% or 10% in 1 year. I believe in pursuing lots of different options until we have to make a decision. So I don't want to base it on what all we can cut this time, because I think sometimes if we take drastic cuts, we want to reflect on it for what future cuts may look like. You can't just cut everything and then go forward. So maybe even a couple, obviously lots of different options, but also option one and then option two for the next year, just to see some different options. I'm sure there's other people.
I have concerns that we're knocking up against our employees have not had raises in a while. They didn't expect them. They didn't ask for them. They understand. But how long are they going to understand when other districts are giving them? So I think for us, we get into a position where if we're cutting a little bit every year, we can never get to the point where we offer raises, and that's unacceptable. We're going to lose our staff, and we can't. So we need to find the cuts to get us where we need to be so that we can keep and reward the best staff, and we're not losing everybody. So I think I don't like continuing to cut a little, because when you're making budget cuts, it's very hard to talk about ever giving a raise. So I think that's something we really have to look for, that balance, because again, I don't think we can expect to keep our staff if we don't offer raises eventually and sooner rather than later. Again, they don't expect it this year. They probably don't expect it next year. but it needs to be on the horizon.
And I do agree with you on that one. And when I talk about doing cuts in the future, it might be right-sizing programs, not necessarily making drastic cuts in other ways. You know, it might be, okay, now we're looking at, Performing Arts Center. You know, but I'm just saying is that doesn't affect your people.
You said that out loud.
Well, but I didn't believe it. But I'm just
I'll get you.
saying,
I'll
I'm
get
just
you there.
saying is that, as we look at things in the future, it's not always about cutting people and cutting people. It might be looking at right-sizing, especially when we're looking at the inclusion as we get more data on what's working, what's not working. That might help some future decisions on restructuring as well.
Yeah, and the one thing I'll just add is, as Greg said, the projections that are built out are assuming no other changes. We can certainly do some forecasting and planning with some additional changes, and then that can help us to forecast forward into what overall we need to do. So if, revenue go up or go down, if things like the cost of employee compensation goes up or goes down, right? That can all be modeled out. So thank you for the comment.
So I have a comment about special education and how it was discussed tonight. Because there was a lot of pages on that and surrounding that. I do know it's a big chunk of the funding. It wasn't talked about as part of inclusive practices as much as it was talked about as in special day classes or as the exclusion part of it. So I'm concerned about cuts to that because I know both Tim and David asked about legal quite a bit. So my concern is when we start looking at cuts, we are already making quite a bit of legal settlements in ADR to pay for people that are losing or not getting their services done. If we're making more staff cuts or service cuts to those for offer of FAPEs, or where they're just not getting done, those legal fees are gonna go up. So it's just gonna be a trade-off. We're not, we're not meeting our students' needs now because we've gotten rid of staff, and we're going to then pay more money in legal fees. And that doesn't go away. So, I guess that's something I just want to keep in everybody's mind.
Yeah, just sort of reiterating what you said to your comments. I think several scenarios with a couple few different levers pulled. I mean, you could iterate 50 different scenarios, right? And I like, we don't need 50, but I like to see ranges, especially something like COLA, right? What would happen if, COLA instead of 243 is, between 2 and 3, right? A couple different scenarios of that. So it sounds like your head's there too, and how far would that happen, right? So that's just one thing that came to mind. And I think ultimately, one of my notes here that I've mentioned before, what we're deciding here eventually, is one of two things, right? It's we're either gonna look back and we did something we shouldn't have done, or not did something we should have done, right? It's sort of that alpha and beta risk that we're kind of weighing between, and that's what we just need to be careful. And you said it, land the plane softly, how we think we should take care of this, and those were some of my comments. And yeah, just with the scenarios, I'd like to understand some of these risk factors as far as revenue goes, from COLA and what may happen. That we can't predict the future, no one can, but yeah, I'd like to see that. So thanks.
I'll just touch on three things real quick. First of all, I would agree with Michelle. When you're in a company or organization that's in a cost-cutting mode for multi-years, it's very harmful for staff morale, right? And so I would much rather that we right-size first and stop being in the red. Then we can move forward as a right-sized organization. Employees and staff can feel good about being able to get raises, being able to stay with the organization long-term. It's very demoralizing to be in the constant cost-cutting mode and not knowing if you have a future with the organization. So I would be in favor of making a deeper initial cut first, get us in the black sooner, then we can continue to grow that way. The second thing is, next time we meet, the financial scenarios are great, except we don't know what would get us to that point, right? We need to understand what are the impacts to the district, to the community, to get to those dollar amounts. So the next time we have this meeting, hopefully you will provide, hey, to get a $7 million cut, these are the things that we're looking at cutting, and provide some options for the board to consider. For a $15 million cut, these are the things that we consider cutting. And then we can have that conversation about, and the board can decide on a policy basis, we don't want to cut these things, so then you can go back and look for alternatives. But we need to have that conversation before the board can give you direction on go cut $15 million, go cut $10 million, because we will be doing it in a vacuum, and that's not possible for us. And as part of that scenario building, it will be very helpful to see spending by program, right? If we're approaching cutting by fair share or percentage here and there, I don't think that's a very effective way. We should be looking at the cost effectiveness of our programs to see which programs are producing the results that we wanted when we started the program. So it'll be helpful to see a list of the programs and what are the associated expenses for the program, as well as how many students are being served by that program, and any information we can have as a board to know how effective those programs are. We really can't be cutting costs in a vacuum without knowing how effective the programs are. So these are the things I hope to see in the next iteration, and appreciate all the work that's gone into it.
I just want to take a moment to also recognize Minnie Melton. Minnie put all of this together, and she laboriously did it along with some support from Wendy and others, but I will say she's been a terrific partner in the 4 years I've been here, and I wanted to recognize her because she's a great egg. And 4 months. Well, maybe it seems like 4 years, but it's been 4 months, yes. 4 CBO. But thank you, and Mindy, if you're watching, thank you very much.
Again, want to thank Greg and his entire team, and I want to thank the board for spending time digging into this. It's important work. Your willingness and ability to dig in is really excellent and serves our community well. So thank you.
All right, this was fantastic information. Thank you, everyone, and we are adjourning at 6:48.